So, we're going to talk about trends for the future of church today. But before we get to that, Carey, I've never claimed to be good at forecasting the future. I think you seem to dabble in that maybe a little bit more than I do. So, for those of us that may not be good forecasters of the future, do you think it's possible to improve that ability to predict the future? And if so, how would we do that?
There's a very fine line between prophecy, fallacy, and inerrancy. And I'm not
Mm.
sure when I cross it, or errancy, I should say. I'm not sure when I cross it very often, Tony. I'm sure I do. But you know what? To me, it's a question of connecting the dots. It's like, you and I have talked about this before. You can walk into a church given decades of experience and within 3 to 5 minutes have a pretty good sense
That's
of
right.
what the issues are. Oh, these guys are overstaffed, or they're understaffed, or the culture here feels stagnant, or this is really vibrant. Like you pick up on that. You've got spidey senses. And I mean, if you look at my strength finders, future is among the top five, depending on when I take it. It's always in that top five. And I think what it is, it's connecting the dots. It's just looking at what's happening in culture, trying to read what's happening right now, and then making extrapolations. And one of my favorite ways to think about it is Erwin McManus told me a few years ago. He said, the best way to predict the future of the church is simply to look at the present. You don't need to be a futurist. Like, if you can see the present clearly, you can see the future. And I think he's right. There are trends that are happening like AI. The adoption rate is slow in the church. Or, this whole idea of monologue or driving attendance. There's very few organizations that have been as fixated on that as the church. And suddenly, it's taken us a while. We're now thinking about engagement. We're now thinking about, oh, don't just get views, actually connect with people. So
Right.
we tend to be a little behind the culture on that. So what I'm trying to do is trying to connect the dots. What's happening in the culture, what's happening in the church, and then how can we extrapolate it? And sometimes, honestly, I'll be the first to admit it. I've done church trends now for maybe 7, 8 years. I have multiple editions. Sometimes it's just stating the obvious clearly. It's not
Mm.
that I'm really out there a decade in advance. It's just like leaders are so busy and they have a read through something or they watch a video and they go, well, of course. And if I can bring a little bit of clarity to like, this is the direction you should point the ship, then I'm really grateful.
Well, I think I have strength when we were looking at how is the church doing today, but I'm going to continue to
Uh,
rely on you to help me think about the future, if that's okay, Carey.
well, it's a lot of fun for me. And, it's funny because I have been doing them probably since the mid 2010s. And I look back on it and, I haven't got like a scorecard or anything, but most of them are like, oh yeah, that was a good
That
call.
actually
Like,
happened,
and
yeah.
you can see it happening. Mm-hmm.
Well, this conversation that we're about ready to dive into is really prompted by an article that you wrote on trends in recent months, and so I'd like to begin talking about generational trends. When our team engages with the church, Carey, we study the demographic data to help the church focus on who they're trying to reach in their mission field. And in most cases right now, millennials and Gen Z make up more than a half the population of the community for
Yeah.
many of the churches that we're working with. Interestingly enough, a lot of those churches are still being led by a pastor who's from the boomer generation. So,
Mm-hmm.
what are the implications of those generational trends for churches, especially as it relates to reaching young adults and young families?
Well, I think you've hinted at it in the way you phrased the question. And so, my big church trend for this year, the one that I'm really paying attention to, is that boomer church is dead. So, a couple of things. I didn't mean dead. That's a bit of hyperbole, but, follow the argument for a minute. What a lot of church leaders struggled with is boomers were often the last to return to church. And we assumed for a little while that that was probably COVID. And if you look at it, they have historically been some of our best volunteers and our best givers. And a lot of boomers tapped out. They're like, yeah, we're going to come back, but rather than being on the guest services team every week, we'll do once a month, or we're just not back at the same level that we were. So you can look at that as COVID related, but COVID in many ways was a really big reset for a lot of people. And what happened during COVID is the boomers got a year or two older. I won't have the math exactly right, but I think the youngest boomer this year is 59, and the oldest is now pushing into his or her 70s. Like, it will not be long until boomers are now in their 80s. The silent generation is getting older and older. So you think about that. Well, historically, what happens when people are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s? They tend to get a little less active. My financial planner says retirement, which I have no plans on doing, has 3 stages: go, slow go, and no go. And I think he's right. If you look at how a lot of people retire, right, there's we're going to travel around the world. And then there's, we're going to do one big trip. And then there's, I'm not venturing outside of my kitchen. And boomers are now just demographically, like life stage, getting into that place. And a lot of pastors still think of boomers as the heart of the church. And if you've got a declining church, that's probably still true. If you have a growing church, you're probably thinking, well, there are key donors. I would encourage leaders to examine the data on donations, because what happens when, your prime income years where the trajectory is still up are your 30s, 40s, and 50s. You've got momentum. You hit your 60s, a lot of early retirements, a lot of not going to get a lot better than this. And then for a lot of people, there's a switch that flips and you move from earning income to whatever you happen to save over the course of your life. And perhaps, if you're lucky, a pension plan. And that's it. Then you're stuck with your 401ks, your Roth IRAs, and you move to a fixed income. So what typically happens is that giving declines. Maybe they are in Florida for a few months of the year or somewhere else, or visiting their kids. Volunteering declines. So it's not that boomer church is dead overnight, but as far as being the backbone generation, there's a massive shift happening right now. And surprise, surprise, guess who gets left out, Tony? Gen X. We're sort of around. I'm barely Gen X. I was born in 65. You're
Carey,
Gen X.
I like to refer to our generation as the greatest generation.
There you go. Well, no one's listening, so it doesn't, not to this podcast. I mean, to us. Ask Rich Birch. Rich Birch, I know, a mutual friend, right? Rich is like, we always get ignored. We always get ignored. He's Gen X. So Gen X is sort of around, and they're sort of the church leadership. But if you really look at it, it's shifting to millennials. And there's growing evidence. I've seen a couple of studies this year that millennials are already more generous than boomers, and they're going to receive the inheritance from the boomers. So there's I think it's $3 trillion. I always forget the stat that's being transferred in the next decade from boomers to their children. Probably not going to churches. It's going to their kids. So all of a sudden you're going to have these millennials who are now, by the way, edging into their 40s. Think about that.
Yeah.
Who have more money, more time, prime of life, massive inheritance. And they were also first back to church. Surprise, surprise. The millennials stream back. They've got kids. They're excited. They're invested. They're moving forward. And then Gen Z, we can talk about them a little bit more. They're coming along too. So I think that's the biggest shift. And it's really like a massive pivot from where we were even a couple of years ago.
Yeah. So I think you're spot on related to, it's the giving conversation that typically comes up with the churches that we're engaged with, and churches who are more mature. A lot of the giving is still coming from the boomer generation. That's not an indication that boomers are more generous. That's an indication that that church has not reached young adults. They're not reaching Gen X. They're not reaching millennials. Actually, Carey, fascinating information. This is fresh data that we've collected. Any guess on the generation that is most overrepresented on church staff teams right now?
I'm going to guess Gen X.
Actually, it is boomers. So boomers are
boomers.
It's not the largest percentage of staff, but they're the most
59 and older.
That's right. That's the generation that's most overrepresented when you compare to the percentage of the population, the working age population. And then the most underrepresented. Any guess on what generation is the most underrepresented on church staff teams?
I'm 0 for 1. Let me guess Gen Z.
You're correct. Yeah. And some of that I
Okay.
think is stands to reason because the 18-year-olds, a lot of the Gen Z are still hopefully in school or pursuing kind of whatever their future path forward is. And because of that, they may not be on church staff teams yet at this point. But just some fascinating information to look at. Speaking of Gen Z, though, uh, I
Uh-huh.
think we're talking. I actually think I have two Gen Zers in my house and two millennials in my house. I can't remember the exact age range. Do you recall how
Yeah,
old
I
the?
do actually. I did some research preparing for this.
Yeah.
So it does vary. Mileage will vary depending on how you drive. But most of the reports would say 97 to 2012.
Okay.
So that would be 97, 26 to right on down to 2012, 11. So
Okay.
you're really middle school through to just barely working.
Yep.
Now, that said, the Pew Research Center just announced it was handling generations entirely differently today. I got to do a deep dive into that. And they're like, sometimes it's stage related, right? Like
Uh huh.
when who was it who said, if you're not a revolutionary in your 20s and conservative in your 50s, I can't trust you. I forget who said
I
that, but
don't know.
there's some truth to that, right? You
Yes,
tend to
there
be more
is.
radical when you're younger. It's like, I'm never going to have a house. I'm never going to settle down. I'm never going to have a career. You look at millennials, they have houses, they have kids, they've settled down. A lot of them live in the suburbs. Now, there are some really meaningful differences. Some of them are living out of their van and climbing in Yosemite every day, but that's a substrata of the population. A lot of it is age and stage. But yeah, generally that's Gen Z, 1997 to 2012.
So I think the data would indicate that this generation, Gen Z, is largely unchurched at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
think the biggest reason is because their parents weren't connected to a church. But we can.
Yeah, yeah,
I guess the
it
question I
is
have is, do
an
we have
hypocrisy.
hope that we can continue to engage this generation and help this Gen Z generation take steps towards Jesus and the church?
I think as long as the gospel's involved, there's always hope. And so I'm gonna start with that broad overview. Yeah, there's definitely reasons for hope. So you're right. They're the most broadly unchurched, spiritually fluid generation that we've ever seen in our culture. However, they're spiritually open. They're more spiritually open after the pandemic than they were before the pandemic. Something like 68% consider themselves religious, but don't think that translates into church attendance. It's almost like I'm spiritual, but I'm not sure about your congregation. Or
Mm.
if I believe Jesus, that's great, but my beliefs might be a little bit fluid, I might define orthodoxy a little bit different than you do. And I may not be at church on a regular basis, but sure, yeah, I'm open. So it's not like you see atheism making this huge upsurge. We are spiritual people, we're spiritual beings, but that's expressing itself differently. And boomers and the silent generations, it meant you just went to church. That's just what you did. Gen X started to question that, kick the tires. Millennials were like, yeah, I really don't know. There's a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of problems in the church. Gen Z comes along and they're now 4 generations into this rethink,
Right.
and they're not necessarily in. However, if they're in, they're locked in. So if you've got Gen Z in your church and they seem to be committed, they really are committed. They would be on fire. What you saw, flickers of in Asbury in the winter of 2023 is probably the closest thing to a preview of Gen Z church we've had on a national scale. And so I think that tiny percentage that's still around is engaged, wants to be discipled, is on board. And although we can talk about evangelism, it's a double-edged sword with the next generation, probably is open to sharing their faith with their friends under the right conditions. So there's an asterisk beside evangelism with Gen Z because they think it's wrong to convert someone over from another belief system. So they may be very devotedly follow Jesus, but because truth has been redefined first by liberals and now by conservatives as relative in our generation. Think about that for a minute. Just hit rewind on that for a while. The liberals started saying truth is relative, and now the conservatives say, well, we'll just make up our own truth. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. But because truth is relative, they're a little bit hesitant in sharing their faith unless they come across as judgy or, oppressive or colonialist, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, there is hope for sure.
Carey, when we start to talk about next generations, it does raise questions about technology, digital strategy for churches, especially. And for a moment, COVID forced every church online. Now, I mean, just to be honest, I think many pastors that I'm talking with in recent months, they would prefer to kind of shut down all of their online content, hoping that might force people back to physical gatherings, especially their Sunday services. Of course, our data suggests that would be a poor decision, because what we see in the data is that more churches, the churches that have more online engagement are actually seeing higher attendance growth in the season. So what are your current thoughts regarding online ministry strategy, digital strategy, and how that might impact physical in-person ministry for churches?
I'm getting the same DMs, often not from the senior leaders because they think it's a great idea, but it's from their staff who are like, my senior pastor is thinking about throttling back online so that we can grow in-person attendance. I'm like, great, So is Walmart, so is Amazon. So it's like, come on, like yeah. I get it. Nobody likes to speak to an empty room, but if I really believe this. Everybody you want to reach is online. Everybody you want to reach is online. And I did some recent research for some writing I'm doing. It's a ridiculous amount. Like 98% of Gen Z have a smartphone. And what people do, the way we behave these days, and this is probably true of virtually everybody listening to this episode, Tony. Let's say a friend says, hey, let's do a vacation together this summer. You're like, great, I'm in. And we're going to go to pick a destination, Virginia Beach. Okay, never been to Virginia Beach. Awesome. But we said yes because we love the Morgans and they're great people. What are my wife and I going to do before we go to Virginia Beach? We're not going to just blindly trust the Morgans. We're going to go and explore. We're going to find the best
Of course
Airbnb.
You're not.
No, of course we're not.
You're never going to blindly trust Morgans.
And even if we did, and you and Emily sent us the agenda, I'd want to see the Airbnb. I'd want to see the beach. I'd want to know the restaurants we're going to go to. I'd want to check out the menu. My wife is dairy free. I want to make sure that we can accommodate that. So we're checking everything else out online first. And if you restrict your digital presence, you're basically saying to the world, we don't care very much about you. What you're really asking people to do is just roll the dice and hope it's a good in-person experience, or trust your social media, which is harder and harder to find. Thank you, algorithm. And if you make it really hard for people to find you, good luck, because most people are going to give up, or they're going to find another church. Because if they're spiritually open and they're searching online and you show up, I mean, they want to try before they buy. Very few of us, except for a year during the pandemic, would ever purchase a vehicle, particularly a used vehicle, without first test driving it or having it assessed by a mechanic. We kind of bypassed our brains for a year while everybody went crazy buying homes without home inspections. And people are like, oh no, we got termites. Oh no, this thing leaks, right? You are going to check it out online. You're going to inspect before you show up. And that's what you're doing. So if you want to kill your front door, if you want to lock your front door and make it really difficult for people to find you, great. Throttle back your online presence, shut down that live stream. And the 5 people you're hoping will shut down their laptop, 2 will come back, maybe. 3 are going to move on and find some other church. And, there's probably 1 or 2 in the mix who won't even notice and go, oh, I don't know what happened to them, but they'll go on with their lives. And you're not going to reach the rest. So I could go on for days. I think it's the dumbest way to grow church attendance. I'll be that bold. I'll use that phrase, but it's a really bad strategy. So change it, repent, do something different, like boot that thing back up, because you're shutting your front door, you're slamming it shut.
So related to this, Carey, I think one of the problems with how most churches are engaging their digital strategy is they're defining the wrong win. So currently, I think the win for most churches when it comes to online is to get more people watching the service and to get the pastor's messages online everywhere they can: YouTube, Facebook, church online platforms, and so on. And I say that because I'm convinced that I'm wrestling with this, because I think the right win has more to do with how we view online as opposed to how we help people take their next steps towards Jesus once they're connected to church and connected to the faith. And related to that, I just think when it comes to discipleship, as an example, it has to be highly relational. I think God designed us for community with other people. And related to that, then leveraging online strategies to help people take their first steps towards faith in church. I think that's a great thing. But then after that, the goal, I think, should actually be connecting people relationally, helping them actually have those face-to-face connections and conversations with other believers. So it's almost as if online, we play to its strengths through the front door stuff, but then I don't know how much online is going to help us when we actually get to the real discipleship and spiritual formation and actually helping believers take their next steps towards Christ, and thinking that might need to be really focused more on connecting face to face in person. So that's just my general thinking on all that related to what is the real win for churches online. And I just want to know, do you think I'm acting like a boomer in a Gen X body again, or is there something to that?
I agree with you. And I want to take it a little bit further. You said something where you said, I feel like we're leveraging the potential of online for front door. I partially agree with that, but I want to challenge it because I think the way a lot of pastors think about their online ministry, whether that's social media, streaming, their YouTube channel, their website, it's free advertising. I know it's not free because you have staff or you have an agency or whatever. It's not free, but they think of it as free advertising. So we're just going to put these digital moving billboards, right? These clips online. Everyone's going to find us. I'm going to blow up. I'm going to go viral. And then everyone's going to come into our church. It just doesn't work that way. Even if you get, in fact, I would argue 100 views on YouTube where you actually have engagement is better than 1,000 views on YouTube where you have no engagement. Let me explain. Last viral video anybody listening to this podcast watched. Who did it? Chances are we have no idea who it was. It was funny. We watched it for 15 seconds. I was like, oh, that was cool. Or, let's say you were playing handy person on Saturday and you had to figure out how to change a lawnmower blade. You just Googled how to change a lawnmower blade, typed in your model number, found this guy working in his garage going, this is how you do it. Make sure you disconnect the spark plug. Did you follow him? Did you give him money? No, you didn't do any of that. You're like, now I know how to fix that's how people are accessing your online content. And what you need to do is you got to stop the scroll and you've got to figure out engagement. You got to have someone, when someone leaves you a comment, have somebody following up with them going, Tony, I'm so glad this is a super helpful email. Hey, do you have any other challenges around the garage or the backyard that we can help with? And you're like, well, actually, yeah, I've got to fix a shower head. Can you guys help with that? It's like, yeah, totally. Check out this YouTube channel. We'll help you out with that. You're like, okay, now I know this guy. I like this guy. I'm going to follow him. I'm going to subscribe because I got to fix that shower head next weekend. So I know that's a really simple example, but that's how engagement works. So you got to run, and having someone follow you isn't enough. It's starting to build that relationship with them. So what you want to do is figure out a way, and there are easy ways to do this, is digital marketing, is you want to capture their contact information. This is voluntary, not spammy, but if there's enough value in what someone saw you provide them online, they'll be like, yeah, let me give you my email address. Let me give you my cell number. At that point, you have what Seth Godin calls permission marketing. You have permission to message them. You don't want to blow that, but then you start to build a relationship with them. And as you do that, they're like, I really like Tony. I want to check it out. Oh, he's got a podcast. Oh, he actually leads church services. Oh, their church is in my neighborhood. All right, I think I'm going to go check it out. But you're walking them down the path. And I think if there's 4 or 5 steps in the digital marketing funnel, pastors stop at step 1, which is, I got 1,000 views. I got 100 likes. No. You don't even know who those people are. They could be bots. But some of them are real people. You got to connect with them. Then you have to have some kind of relationship. You have them opt in. Permission marketing begins. You start to build a relationship. You get to know them. That's how discipleship starts. That's where you invite them into things you're doing. Then maybe they make a decision for Christ. Then they get baptized. But It's a process. And it used to start in the front door of the building. Now it starts on the internet.
All right, Carey, this is tough because we could go on and on and on a variety of different topics related to trends in the church. But let's wrap up with this topic because I know there are a lot of senior teaching pastors listening into the conversation. I've heard you talk about sermon shifting from being an attraction to being an anchor. Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, this is a very fluid thought. And I almost didn't include it in my Church Trends post, but I thought, no, there's something shifting here and I don't know what it is. So let's revisit this in a year or two and we'll see if it's right. But there was a sense in which, and I think it's still true, that the majority of people select a church according to the teaching and the preaching. So it's really important. But what happened was scarcity drives value. So go back, if a lot of boomer senior pastors are listening, you'll remember this. In the 90s, because that's when I started, you were sort of the only show in town. If you wanted a really good understanding of the scripture and an interpretation for your life, you really had to attend a local church or subscribe to a cassette ministry or CD ministry, which nobody practically did. And the internet wasn't really much at the time. So you kind of had a, quote, monopoly on the market, except for, the half dozen or dozen or 20 other churches within reasonable driving distance of where you were. Then what happened was Web 2.0 showed up with Facebook and social media. You could start to share clips. And this whole idea of blowing up and going viral beyond the New York Times bestselling list, it got democratized. And suddenly the local church, for pennies on the dollar, could start to have a presence on social media. The 2010s hit and people really started to figure out how to do this. And they started doing a very good job of it. And then there was, I want to be the next Mike Todd. I want to go viral with relationship goals and blow this church up from 200 to, 20,000 or 2 million online or whatever. And of course, those are the unicorns. Those are the very rare confluences of grace and circumstance and everything. It's probably not going to happen to you and to me. But we kind of live in this world where that's what we think it is. And we're programming as though every Sunday, every series is going to be our big breakthrough, right? Like, don't miss this Sunday. Don't miss this Sunday. Hey, after Easter. Hey, after Christmas. Hey, now that school's back, off we go. And of course, for the most part, it doesn't happen. The same people show up and maybe a few more, or you hit a little bit of momentum. So you can play that game forever, but you get on this treadmill, this hamster wheel of constantly thinking you're moments away from going viral. So take the late Tim Keller as an example. I interviewed Tim a few times. Wonderful, wonderful man. I'm not sure Tim Keller spent a lot of time thinking about how to go viral. In fact, no. I could be corrected, but I'm sure that thought never entered his mind. So how did he go viral? It wasn't like he built a platform hoping that people would hear his message. He worked on his message and the platform built itself. And I think there's truth to that. So what does now, and remember too, okay, so this is why it's a thought in transition. Your congregation has access to all the messages that you do. And some of them have 2 or 3 preachers. And some of the stuff out there, believe it or not, I know this is going to be shocking, Tony, it's not orthodox. Believe it or not. There are false teachers out there. There's like internet quacks. There's people who don't know what they're talking about. So, your sermon could be an attraction. That's great. And if it is, awesome. Good for you. I'm glad you were the unicorn. That's fantastic. But increasingly, probably what it's going to be is an anchor. There's a lot of online weirdness out there. People can go down rabbit holes and end up with we are always worried about the people who are too into Revelation, at our churches. There's a lot of channels that just subscribe to that. So what you're doing now, yes, it's an attraction and hopefully you're a good communicator, but you're also an anchor to your people because they are in a sea of information and misinformation. And to use Keller as an example, I think that's what he was for so many of us, is in a world that was going increasingly crazy. Keller would go to the scriptures, would go to a historic Orthodox understanding of Christianity, chess. Is this mic working? Okay, here we go. Here comes a sermon. And it wasn't anything flashy. It wasn't anything crazy, but it was an anchor for my soul. And so I'm thinking that is what's going to happen to a lot of pastors. And occasionally you'll have somebody go viral, but for the most part, we're going to anchor our people in where we're heading, where the gospel is pointing. And I think that can be very refreshing because it takes the pressure off of you. It takes the pressure off your social media team, and you can preach what you were called to preach. Does that make sense?
It sure does. By the way, one of my first questions when I get to heaven is, why in the world did you include the book of Revelation? It's just confusing me. My second question is going to be, why did you allow for the creation of saran wrap? Because that stuff is just annoying. I just.
Oh, that's great.
All right. Well, Carey, it's always fun to talk with you.
It's always
and
great,
I
Tony.
Love your heart for Jesus and the church and church leaders, and the fact that you do spend some time investing, thinking about the future of church is so helpful to me, and I think it's helpful to a lot of church leaders. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. And I really appreciate you, Tony, you and your team. I mean, I'm a podcast listener. I also avidly read what you write and can't wait for the quarterly Unstuck Church report. So you have so formed my thinking, and I'm really glad over these last 10 or 15 years we've become friends, and really thankful for you and your contributions. So keep doing what you do, and I will keep taking notes.